the seed of this book was planted when I came across in a history of slavery and abolition in the British Empire, this story of the Jamaica Maroons. This was a community in Jamaica that were descended from runaway slaves who signed a treaty in the mid 18th century with the British that said these were people, living in the mountains, evading capture, harassing the plantations. And the British said to them, we know we're never going to fully subdue you. So we'll give you land that you can come and settle on. We'll guarantee your freedom. In exchange, you act as enforcers of the plantation system. You don't take any more runaways. You send them back to their plantations if you capture them. And you help us suppress occasional uprisings as well. One of these groups of Maroons, the Trelawney Town Maroons, they rebel in the 1790s because they think that there are still further concessions they can win from the British. In response, the British deport them to Nova Scotia. So I came across this journey, Jamaica to Nova Scotia in 1796. And I think it struck me for a couple of reasons. The first is I always love histories that connect unexpected people and places. One of my favorite novels is Annie Proulx's Bark Skins, which is this great multi-generational epic about the destruction of the American forests. But that contains, there's a character in the 17th century who's in Canada, but then he travels to China. And there's another character in the 19th century who is in New England, but he goes to New Zealand. And the fact that you don't think of these places as connected, but often they were all part of one imperial system. Jamaica and Nova Scotia at this time, both part of the British Empire. But we learn history in the present in such national silos that we don't think about connecting those dots and drawing those threads together. So that was the first thing I think that drew me to the story. And the second is a more personal thing, which is that my grandparents made the trip from the Caribbean, from Barbados and St. Lucia to England, and I'd grown up with all these stories of how different the weather was, of how my grandmother had never seen fog before she came to London, the punishing cold of the British winters, which have nothing on Nova Scotia, but are definitely cold if you grew up in St. Lucia or Barbados. And so there was always already something so evocative to me of how would it feel to go from a warm place to a cold one. And so that was what started me thinking about this novel and gave me my protagonist, Cora, who's one of the Jamaica Maroons. She's an orphan who has ended up exiled from her homeland. And as the book opens, she's grieving home. She's grieving people that she's just lost in this war against the British. She's wandering out in the forest near Preston, just outside Halifax, which is where her community has been settled. And she thinks that she can see a mysterious figure out in the wilderness alone. And this turns out to be a woman, Agnes, who is from the other Black community in Nova Scotia at the time. This was the African-American loyalists who had won their freedom fighting for the British in the American War of Independence. The British said, if you flee your plantations and come to us, we'll give you your freedom. Obviously, the British lose that war, and so they can't guarantee that freedom if people stay in the United States. So instead, they offer people passage to Nova Scotia, and that's where a lot of them settle. So Agnes has those roots in the American South, in slavery there, but she's now living on her own, clearly in hiding from something, we don't know quite what. Cora is increasingly drawn into Agnes's world out in the wilderness. The book opens in winter, but the seasons change. The weather thaws. You get spring, you get summer, you get the coming of the humpback whales that Agnes and Cora go out on their boats to see. And over this process of being drawn together, the two women fall in love, and that's the story. The supporting cast allowed me firstly to flesh out just some more of the history. So you get different members of the Maroon community with different relationships to being a Maroon. So Cora's adopted mother, Leah, for example, is someone who, I mentioned this treaty that was signed. So the Maroons weren't really meant to take runaways after 1739, but they did sometimes. And so Leah is someone who is actually born in Africa, captured, enslaved, brought to Jamaica on a plantation, and then ends up in the Maroon community. So unlike Cora, who's born free, Leah has been enslaved in the past. You've got the other Maroons around them, all of whom have a different relationship to being in exile in Nova Scotia, what they want, where they want to go next. And so all of that is trying to bring a bit of a sense of the community around Cora. Then some of the other characters, Thursday is one of my fondest secondary characters in the novel, and he's an indentured labourer, a farm labourer in Nova Scotia with a similar background to Agnes of being African-American. So again, giving more insight into who would have been the Black people in Nova Scotia at this time, what would have been their journey to reaching this point, and what can they also show us about some of these central questions of what does it mean to be free, what would you do to get free, different forms of love in the novel as well. Thursday is someone who there was a possibility when I started drafting that he might have formed more of a possible love interest for Cora, and their relationship, it would have been more like a love triangle, but I decided against that. I'm someone who has many wonderful platonic male friends, and I always like to reflect that in my work, but also they almost have a kind of sibling-esque bond that I think is very beautiful. So different kinds of love featuring as well. And then finally, I mentioned earlier in River Sing Me Home, and I wanted to bring back this sense too of the world that exists outside the novel. Like the form necessitates that you zero in on an individual story or an individual set of characters, but there's so much beyond that. And again, we're dealing with people who real historical examples of African American loyalists, Jamaican Maroons, wouldn't really have been able to read or write, wouldn't have left much behind in the archives. And the structure of the novel is that it's all pretty much in close third person from Cora's point of view, but it's interspersed with these short chapters where you get into the heads of some other secondary characters. Some of them are Thursday or Leah, quite major to the plot line, but others are incredibly minor to the point of maybe appearing on the page in the main story once or twice. Like there's a woman who is a slave on the same farm that Thursday works. And what I wanted to do with these is give, again, that sense of the beyond, the sense that these characters are all orbiting this central story, but each of them have this huge backstory that you could get into, and there's not time and you're just going to get a glimpse of it and move on, but all of them in their own way can bring their own perspective to bear on the issues of freedom, love, finding home, that are the big themes of the novel. It's funny to me that when I initially conceived of this book, I thought that Cora and Agnes would just be friends. And the reason that's funny is that there's a long-standing, often homophobic trope that two women who are romantically involved are just friends. You see that in contemporary settings, but you definitely see it in the study of history, where there will be these two women who never married and they lived together in a one-bedroom flat for the whole of their lives. And historians will say that they were just very close friends. But there's also, I think, an authentic experience for many queer people, especially women, of growing up and not knowing your sexuality yet and having to interpret the difference between feelings of friendship and something slightly more. So I'm myself bisexual. I didn't realize that about myself until I was about 18. But looking back at some of the experiences I had, I went to an all-girls school where friendships were incredibly intense, and some of the experiences I had aged kind of 12 or 13, I look back on those friendships, I think about the fact that everyone involved has since come out as queer in one way or another. And I think there probably was something not very heterosexual going on with some of those turbulent relationships. And so initially I thought that Cora and Agnes were just friends, and then I realized that for the novel to work, narratively speaking, they were definitely in love. But I bring this up also because in crafting the relationship on the page, we're talking about two characters. Well, certainly Cora, our narrator, opens the book not knowing that she is gay, and also not having access, as we do in the modern world, to the kind of vocabulary to describe her identity that we would use now when figuring it out. And so even though her and Agnes end up as more than friends, she still has to move through those moments of considering, I'm really drawn to this person, I'm really attached to them, I enjoy their company. What does that mean? What is this way that I'm feeling? Why is it so different to the way I feel about so many other people in my life? And it was really beautiful to be able to write that journey that Cora has to go on to understand that what she feels for Agnes is love in a romantic sense. And indeed, there's a point in the book where, before she's kind of fully admitted the scope of her feelings, she just describes it as, she says, what she feels for Agnes is love, a small word with so many meanings. It's almost like admitting the ambiguity of using that to cover a whole bunch of feelings that she's not quite ready to explore yet. And so, yeah, the kind of slow deepening of their bond as they disentangle what is platonic and what is more, that was a lovely thing to be able to write. There's a little bit of using some modern speech patterns and projecting backwards. So in particular, I'm thinking about Jamaican patois, and there's a book that I have called True Born Maroons, which is about the Maroon community, the descendants of which still exist in Jamaica, and it's effectively I think it's an anthropological text, but it's got extended passages of kind of quoted testimony of Maroons in the present day. So it was partly using some of that to pick up on speech patterns that wouldn't have been significantly different than they would have been in the 1790s, and use that to develop the Jamaican voice. And then a little bit of less archival work, because as I say, most of these people, you would only encounter them filtered through the eyes of others. So you might, get their testimony as written in a court document or something, but it's not really going to give you the same sense of voice. So I think you just have to be creative. I mean, I'm also someone, I probably err on the side of lighter touch, accent, dialect, kind of historical speech, because I think it's possible to overdo it and almost kind of like fetishize or create a sense of distance for the modern reader with the way that people were speaking. What I'm generally going for is kind of within the bounds of plausibility. So it's as simple as, and not just actually in the speech itself, but in the text, sometimes you find yourself using metaphors or words. Classically, any metaphor around kind of electricity or trains that you suddenly think, no, I can't use that because those don't exist yet. And a lot of looking up the etymology of words to check would it have been used in that sense in this context. So making sure there's never going to be anything that trips up the reader into thinking this feels anachronistic to me, but otherwise allowing it to be maybe closer to modern speech patterns than would be strictly historically accurate. But that, to me, is a sacrifice worth making to really immerse readers in the story and collapse that effective distance between people now and people in the past. Because what I always come back to as a historian, as a novelist, is sort of, there's nothing new under the sun. People have always been people. Of course, there were big differences in the past, and you're in a very unfamiliar time and place. These characters might have worldviews that are quite different to your own, but there's always some universal human experiences and emotions bubbling under the surface. And I think getting to those to give people that anchor in the story is really important. The final version of the book opens with a trial scene. So you know that two women are in a courtroom. One of them is on trial, the other one is watching. You don't know who is who, you don't know what's happened. And that creates a sense of suspense that then when you jump back in time, all the time that you're reading, and then you come back to that day of the trial over and over through the book and gleaning little bits of detail here and there. That was a structure that came to the book quite late. And I think it helped solve a problem that was present in earlier drafts, where I think I was a bit more withholding of some of that suspense. There's always a sense of kind of secrecy and secrets to be revealed. Just the fact of Agnes living out by herself in the wilderness immediately raises so many questions that, as a reader, you're going to want answers to at some point. But I guess that's a slightly gentler version of the, things are coming down in future that will give you answers to questions. Whereas opening with a trial was a better way, I think, of giving readers a sense, no, there's something big coming, don't worry. The novel then kind of goes back and immerses you perhaps a bit more slowly in getting to understand who these people are, who the community is, where they're living, the natural world, the landscape. Is laying all those foundations. And then that something is going to have to happen to get you to that courtroom. I'm someone who, when I draft books, I'm not an extensive outliner, but I do need to know how the book ends, often to the level of the last line will come into my head and it feels right. And I think to myself, that's enough to motivate me to finish a draft, because when you're in the middle of it, I start at the beginning when I draft and I just work through to the end. I don't go back and tinker as I go. And in the middle of a draft, you'll think it's the worst thing that's ever been written and it should never see the light of day. And the only thing that can keep me going is having that ending in my head and thinking, oh, I do think that ending is good, though I just want to earn it. And to have started the process of the book, I knew how it was going to end and how the trial would resolve. And that part of it didn't change at all as I was working. I guess one thing, again, not wanting to give too much away about the trial, I guess there's how the trial ends, and then there's maybe a bit of why the trial ends. And there was quite a lot in order to understand the fullness of why the trial ends the way it does. It took me quite a long time to work out the way of revealing that information to the reader, because let's just say, the novel is Cora's novel, it's her perspective. She is not herself necessarily privy to all of the logic behind how the trial unfolds. And so that was probably the thing that changed a lot more, that had multiple versions of how are you going to wrap this book up, given you've got the outcome, you need something that ties it all together, that explains some of the why for the reader. That was the bit that was a bit more challenging to get right. I have been as I've been doing kind of promotion for this book, and people tend to ask, what am I working on next? And I do have another book that I'm working on, which is not a strict sequel, but it is, I'm calling them my Freedom Trilogy: River Sing Me Home, Fireflies in Winter, and this new book I'm working on about the Haitian Revolution, because I do think I'm returning again and again to the same themes, even if in very different settings and with different characters. And the themes are, what does it mean to be free in the aftermath of slavery? So River Sing Me Home, obviously set just after emancipation. Fireflies in Winter, set at a time when slavery is very much still legal across most of the Americas, but the characters are free in different ways, more and less precarious, but they are all grappling with the long shadow of enslavement, whether their own or other people's. And then the Haitian Revolution, an uprising that in the 1790s creates the first independent Black republic outside of Africa, is very much, you know, how far would you go for freedom? What does it mean to be truly free in the context of Black revolutionary leaders who rise to the top of the kind of Haitian army and then turn around and say the only way for us to keep supplied with guns and keep the French at bay and stop ourselves being re-enslaved is that we have to keep selling sugar. So if you're not a soldier, you have to go back to your plantation. And that was obviously not a particularly popular decision with kind of the field laborers. So there's so much richness there in that new material. So not strict sequels, but returning often to similar times, similar grounds, and all orbiting around kind of the Caribbean and my own heritage. But one thing I would recommend, especially for writers, if you're worried that you don't feel like, I don't know, you feel like you're always obsessing about the same things. If there are writers that you love, go away and read a bunch of their books back to back. I did this with Kazuo Ishiguro, who is a wonderful writer, the Nobel laureate. I love his work, but I read, I think, about 4 or 5 of his novels in a row, and they're all literally about memory and the idea of service, and that's pretty much it. And it's completely fine, you know, because you publish books over a number of years. There are, I think, only going to be sort of 1 or 2 big themes of your writerly life that you're often returning to from, with Kazuo Ishiguro's work, radically different angles, different genres, but it's, yeah, there are a finite number of things that I think really obsess you, and when you find one of them, it's okay to like keep mining it if it's a particularly rich theme to keep mining.